Moving on to black cards now in our set review for Ravnica Allegiance. Awaken the Erstwhile is really weird. It's totally unplayable in limited. In constructed, maybe there's a way you can build around it, but it's really tricky because you're making a lot of creatures for your opponent. If you're trying to just make a bunch of creatures on it, they're probably making a bunch of creatures too. And if they're making a bunch of creatures too, then your army of 2/2s isn't going to do that much against their army of slightly fewer 2/2s. If you have some kind of a mass pump effect, particularly for zombies, that's an interesting tribe. You do have some zombie lords, I think. Maybe that helps somewhat. I don't really see it though. If there's a way that you can just draw tons and tons of cards, so maybe that sleep deck with Verity Circle that we saw before, that could work with this, I guess. But you have to discard all your hands, so you're not going to have sleep set up right away. So that's a little bit tricky. But maybe there's something you can do with that combination of cards. There's a way that you can set yourself up to be able to cast sleep again. Because then you're tapping down all their 2/2s and it doesn't matter. There's a way you can kill all their 2/2s and that helps. The other thing this can do for you though is mind twist your opponent. Of course, it mind twists you as well. So you have to worry about that. But if there's for some reason you want the cards for you have more value in your graveyard, I don't know. This is wacky enough there could be something good to do with it, but I don't see it right now. Bankrupt in Blood, I think this card is going to be pretty tough to make it work. Like, there's a number of things that you want to sacrifice, but it's pretty hard to have two things in play that you don't mind sacrificing, and then you're not getting paid off that much for this, right? If it's just normal creatures that are just like kind of mediocre at this point, then it's like quite bad. It's so tempo negative to try to draw cards this way. If you're getting more value than that, it's still pretty tempo negative though. So I'm not really seeing this. It's really bad against counterspells as well. Maybe there's a deck that can get enough of them. I don't really see it, especially in limited, but even in constructed, I don't really think this is the kind of sack outlet you want. Let's move on to Blade Juggler. Yeah, 5 mana, 3/2 draw card hits you for 1. That's kind of okay. At 3 mana, 3/2 draw card is pretty good. How often can you spectacle this? I don't know if it's often enough. Hitting you for 1 also hurts a little bit. I think this card is going to be, if you're aggressive enough, it's reasonably good, but even in the 3 mana case, it's not like it's just mind-blowingly amazing. It's only good, right? In the 5 mana case, it's not like mind-blowingly awful though. So I think this is a pretty good card in the right deck, but not amazing. Bladebrand, yeah, this kind of card tends to not be great. You get to trade it and a bad creature for a good creature and a random card from your deck fairly often. So it's like not the most embarrassing thing to play, but you usually don't want to play it. Though there is an uncommon in red that this combos with really well, and if you have even one of those, I might think about including this just because it isn't that bad by itself. But there's an uncommon in red that's 4 mana for 2/3 and pings all your opponent's creatures when it enters the battlefield. If you can have 6 mana, play that in response to the trigger, target it with this, then that's a Plague Wind that you've built. That's a really good combination. Excuse me. Yeah, let's move on to Blood Mist Infiltrator. Whenever it attacks, you can sacrifice. So this is a better sack outlet, I think. As being able to get in is, somewhat helpful. 3 mana, 3/1 is not that great. Just the ability helps you get through your last damage, helps you with your afterlife stuff, helps you enable spectacle. So this is doing some number of good things for you. Obviously, sacking a creature is a pretty big cost to pay, though, so I wouldn't want to do this very often. But if you have enough of that stuff, it can be good enough. It dies to a lot, though. Dies to a lot with the 1 toughness. I can't imagine seeing any constructed play, and well, it's not that bad even if you just trade it off in limited, but usually when I want to be in the right deck to make it really good, it's playable in an average deck, I would expect. Carrion Imp, yeah, it's mostly 4 mana, 2/3 flying, gain 2 life. Exiling, I don't think is usually going to be very relevant. I guess it might be. You need a creature in the graveyard to gain 2 life, but I think there will usually be one. 4 mana, 2/3 flyers, generally a fine card anyway. If not great, being able to gain 2 life definitely helps a little bit, but doesn't make this amazing. It's a fine limited card. Obviously not seeing play anywhere else. Catacomb Crocodile. 5 mana, 3/7 with some pretty nice flavor text. I actually think this is going to be pretty good in limited. 5 mana, 3/5 like is below the curve, but is actually a fine card reasonably often in limited. 3/7 doesn't make it that much better, but there's some 5 power creatures and I guess a few 6 power creatures that this can block safely. And it can attack, and it's harder to double block and kill this or something. Having said that, it's not exciting for 5 mana, but it should be playable. Clear the stage, yeah, so we see things that want you to have creatures of power 4 or greater. It's like a very mini theme in the set, along with the Defender theme being very mini theme. This card is overpriced if you're not getting that benefit. It's kind of hard to get that benefit. There aren't that many creatures that are big enough. But okay, there's some if you're in black-red. Obviously, you can see on the bottom right of the screen there is a common in black that does this. And if you can get a 2-for-1, then that's pretty good. It's not that tempo negative of a 2-for-1. But I think you want to have, 4 or 5 cards, creatures that are big enough in your deck before you even really want to play this. I'm not very excited by it. Obviously, if you can get the 2-for-1, it's pretty good, but I don't know that you're going to be able to get it often enough. Consigned to the Pit, it's expensive removal. The 2 damage is probably not that relevant. I mean, sometimes it'll swing the race. It, I guess, enables Spectacle, but what Spectacle costs you really going to have the mana for after you've cast this 6 mana spell? Not many. But okay, it does enable Spectacle, I guess, in some cases. 6 mana for unconditional removal. Depending on the format, it can be begrudgingly playable or not playable at all. I would play it in sealed, my first copy. Maybe my first 2 copies in sealed. In draft, really kind of depends on your deck, but you try not to, I think. Cry of the Carnarium looks like a sideboard card in both standard and limited. Pretty good maybe in standard. The exile thing could be relevant. Yeah, I don't have a lot to say. Dead Revels. Yeah, at 4 mana we've seen this card sometimes in limited. Usually not quite good enough. It's just a bit too clunky. If you can activate it to play it for 2 mana, then that's pretty good. And an aggressive deck is going to, have its own graveyard full more often. But on the other hand, you don't want to have to chump attack in order to activate this. So I'm not sure. It's probably okay in certain limited decks, and I don't think you see it seeing any play in constructed. There is already a 2 mana spell that you don't have to jump through hoop for from Golgari in the previous set, and that actually does see a lot of play, but it has a backside too. It's a split card, and yeah, find finality just better. Debtor's Transport. So 6 mana for a 5/3 is obviously overpriced. It will trade off, and it will probably trade off for something reasonably good, a 3-drop or a 4-drop, maybe a 5-drop. And then the Afterlife 2 is quite a big deal. It's hard for your opponent to attack into this thing without trading for it. Um, so, if they have a 4-drop that they like to be able to attack into you, you're trading for it and making 2/1/1 flyers. That's pretty good for you. It's not even great for you, though. I think this card is going to be pretty good, and because there aren't that many 6-drops in the set, one of the better ones, but I would still prefer to have something better on 6, but I think I usually won't, so I'll usually play, one of these. Drill Bit. It's a Thought Seize if you have Spectacle. It doesn't, you don't lose life, so that's an upside, but you have to have Spectacle, which usually means you need to attack first, or just like hit them with a burn spell. I think Thoughtseize can be overrated in general anyway. I don't think this card is very good and limited at all. At all. Um, like, even if it always cost 1, I wouldn't be that high on it in limited. I'd probably play it in limited. But it can whiff too much in limited, and it's just not taken a good enough thing very often. Obviously, you can board it in. It's better in sealed, and you can board it in if you've seen some particular bomb or multiple bombs that you just like can't beat. In constructed, it's a lot more interesting because where the Thoughtseize effect is best is where you're breaking up some kind of synergy and or trying to play around counter spells. Um, yeah, the thing is, in the counter spells case, if you're already hitting them, then I'm not exactly sure the Thoughtseize is that great. I mean, you play it on turn 2 with another 1-drop, I guess. Play it on turn 3 and hopefully take their Wrath or something. Yeah, I don't know. It certainly could be playable. And then if there's obviously some high synergy or combo deck, targeted discard can be a lot better there against that. But I am not actually seeing this so much. Let's move on to Font of Agonies. I'm sure it will. By the way, I'm sure Drobit will see play in Standard, but I don't expect myself to play it very much at all. Let's move on to Font of Agonies. This is potentially a repeatable Doomblade, but I don't really see it having a place anywhere that I see. First of all, in Limited, you're just never paying enough life, so it's totally unplayable. But even in Constructed, if you play 4 life after you get this in play, and it has to be after this comes into play, which already hurts off the bat, because like reasonable chance you want to play a shock land untapped to play this on turn 1. You're not going to get that life payment in. But if you somehow pay 4 life after this, then you get a Doomblade. Overall, you've played a murder that you got to split the mana up on. You had to pay life for. Okay. Also, the enchantment can be interacted with, and they're going to know that it's coming, basically. In murder doesn't see that much play to start with, so this mostly worse murder, basically not good enough if you're only killing 1 creature. It starts to get more interesting if you're killing 2 creatures. You paid 8 life or something. You got to kill 2 creatures. But I think this is unlikely enough that you're not really going to see it happen. The only place you could maybe think about this is in some kind of like a Death Shadow deck where you're wanting to pay a lot of life anyway, or you have a lot of things to help you pay life anyway. You have your Street Wraiths, you have your your shock lands and your fetch lands and that kind of thing. But even if you're getting 2 activations out of this, like 5 mana to kill 2 things is okay. You got to split it up. Is pretty good, but it's not the most amazing thing ever. So anyway, I could see it in that kind of deck for particularly grindy matchups, like as a sideboard card maybe, but I'm not really seeing it that much. Grotesque Demise, solid limited card. You're going to play it basically every time, I expect. And up to 2 or 3 copies that you're going to be happy for. Probably not seeing any constructed play, although I guess similar cards have been fringe close to it before. Gutter Bones, yeah. One mana 2/1 is usually fine. Recursive, they have to hit, they have to lose life for it to recur, which is not usually the most opportune time. It's a skeleton warrior, which isn't the greatest types, but I mean it's fine. I expect it to be very plausible in standard anyway. Maybe in some of the sacrifice decks, maybe in just black aggressive decks. In limited, it's okay. Like 1 mana 2/1 enters the battlefield tapped is okay, but not great. How often are you getting it back? Well, even if you get it back once, it's nice card advantage. So it's pretty good and limited, but it's certainly not amazing. I expect there to be maybe even some commons that are probably some commons that are better, and certainly a bunch of uncommons and rares. Ill-Gotten Inheritance. Yeah. If there is a way that you can stall the game out, this can just win the game for you over a long period of time. Um, Gaining a life every turn helps you last longer for the damage to kick in. But in some respects, it's like a 4 mana 1/1 lifelink unblockable, which it's harder to interact with than that, which is a big upside, I think. But I'm not entirely sold on it unless this format is pretty slow and grindy. Yeah, I don't know. I could see it being okay, but um, you know what? In limited, it's probably reasonable, right? Because it has the activated ability, it's often going to be like a 6 mana drain, and that's okay, I guess. I don't know. I'm not sure how to evaluate this. Hard, a little bit hard to evaluate. Uh, Although, given the art, would have expected treasures from the card. Yeah. Noxious Grudian, 3 mana 2/2 Death Touch, perfectly playable. Nothing to write home about. Orzhov Enforcer, 2 mana 1/2 Death Touch, Afterlife 1. Very good card in limited because it's just going to trade with whenever you decide to have your opponent trade with it. And then it's going to have whatever you want to trade with basically on the ground it can trade with. And then it leaves a 1/1 flyer behind. It's really good. It might even be good enough to see some play in Constructed. Now the problem in Constructed is that it's really bad proactively. Right? If you're playing against a control deck, this attacks for 1. And if they wrath you, it leaves a 1/1 behind, which isn't great. But if you have some kind of a sacrifice deck, then this card is okay, a little bit worse in that matchup, so I'm going to sacrifice it away as opposed to something else. I could easily see this one seeing constructed play. But it would take the right deck and or maybe being a sideboard card against mid-range decks with big creatures. Yeah, let's move on. Orzhov Racketeers, 4 mana or 5 mana 3/2 Afterlife 2. Yeah, we had a 6 mana 5/3 Afterlife 2 that I was okay on. 5 mana 3/2. I don't really know. I think that body's a little bit worse, right? 2/1 of stats for an extra mana. 5 to 6 isn't that huge a gap. The body here is a little bit worse. On the other hand, it's also usually going to trade off and at less of a mana disadvantage. And then, I mean, okay, it might trade off with a 2-drop. So I don't know. I think it's actually only slightly better. It's very rarely going to deal combat damage to a player to make them discard a card, though, because they're usually going to have something to block it. It doesn't take that much to block it. Pestilent Spirit, yeah, this card looks very good. Menace Death Touch is a combination that if they have tokens, they can trade with it okay, right? If they play to raise the alarm kind of effect, Saproling Migration for 2. They can trade okay with it, but otherwise it's pretty hard to block without getting at a pretty big disadvantage, as it's going to take 2 blockers and it's going to kill both of them. So that's like a 2-for-1 there, right? And in limited, that's going to be real good. On defense, if you have to be on defense in limited, okay. It's not the greatest thing, but you can. Um, you can block and trade. Like there was a three mana 2/2 death touch we said was fine. This card's obviously better than that, even on defense. Um, as it plays around some of the -2, -0, right? But on defense, it's not much different than that. But that's a fine card on defense. Where it struggles usually is on offense, and this card's much better on offense. And then this second line of text instant and sorcery spells you cast have death touch. Now that's the real interesting part of the card. There's a few things it can do in limited, but okay. The bigger impact is constructed, and I think it could be very good in constructed. There's a Rakdos aggro deck very possible in standard. You can be playing a lot of cards like Shock. And Shock basically turns into Terminate when you have this guy out. You do have to be a little bit wary that this doesn't die in response to you casting the Shock, because that can be a 2-for-1 though. So I don't think this is absolutely great. It does die a little bit easily in standard, but I can definitely see it seeing some amount of play. It's also still hard to block in standard, but easier to kill with removal spells. Let's move on to Plague White. Just a fine limited card. Nothing special, nothing to write home about. Yeah, that's all I got. Priest of Forgotten Gods. Yeah, so as a sack outlet, this is okay, but you do have to untap with it. It has a very fragile body. You have to untap with it. You do get a ton of value back, right? You have to sacrifice 2 creatures, but you get 2 cards worth of value. So presumably you're playing some kinds of cards that don't mind being sacrificed so much, either because they have death triggers or because they have battlefield triggers. You're getting some kind of value somehow, or they're tokens or something, you know? And this has to be other creatures, but it doesn't have to be non-token creatures. So anyway, you also get some mana back. So it's some weird black ramp also, kind of. But there is enough stuff that I think there might be a deck that you can play this in. Even though it's a little bit fragile and it's a bit slow, and it's a lot worse than if you would say have Bloodthorn Vampire. In limited, you can do this at instant speed also. It's very worth noting. It makes this also a pretty good card in limited. You're getting your 2-for-2 back. You can chump and sack. You can sack in response to a removal spell. It does have to be other creatures, so they're probably spending any small removal spells they have on this. But yeah, so I don't think it's amazing in limited, but it's very playable. Rakdos Trumpeter, 2 mana 1/3 menace. I mean, it's vaguely playable, mostly as a blocker. If you have the red activation, 4 mana to make it a 3/3 menace, yeah, that's not exciting. This one seems worse than the Azorius one that we saw earlier, but begrudgingly playable and limited. Spawn of Mayhem obviously is broken. Well, not broken, but it's very good and limited. I don't know if it's actually better than it's probably a little bit better than the 4 mana Sphinx we saw earlier in limited, but they're very close. Damaging both you and your opponent is, yeah, it can be an upside, it can be a downside. Now this is more better than the other card. That's not a redundancy. I'm saying that it's better than the other card to a larger degree in constructed than it is in limited. Where you can cast it for 3 mana reasonably often, hopefully, right? And a 3 mana 4/4 Flying Trample is above the curve, or at least on curve, but I think above the curve basically in standard, right? 3 mana 4/4 is fine in standard. Getting Flying and Trample on top, that's pretty good. You're going to play this obviously in a very aggressive deck, so that hopefully the damage is going to be more beneficial to you than harmful to you. Are you really going to be profitably growing this? Yeah, I'm not so sure. There are a number of black cards that help you damage yourself, and you could play them in black aggressive decks. At some point, you do have to worry about dying yourself, though, so I'm not exactly sure. I'm not entirely sold that this is going to be a great card in Standard, but it will definitely see play from some people, and it might be very good. Um, Spire Mangler, Flash Flying, 3 mana 2/1 flying is already basically good enough. With Flash, you can flash it in and trade it for like a 4/4 or a 5/4 on defense, which is a fine thing to do with your 3 mana. You can also maybe use it as a combat trick, I guess. More likely, it's basically just going to be a 3 mana 2/1 flyer and or pump one of your other flyers to get in for 2 more damage. But that's totally fine already in limited. Can it see play in constructed? I don't really see it. No. Thirsting Shade, 1 mana for a 1/1 lifelink is not really good enough, I don't think. And this pump ability is so expensive that I still don't think it's good enough in any format, really. Undercity Scavenger. When it enters the battlefield, so this is similar to that blue 4 mana 3/3 that could turn into a 5/5, but this one's black and wants you to sacrifice a creature. So again, there's all kinds of this black sacrifice stuff going on. So those enablers, the things that want to get sacrificed, are going to be a lot more premium than you might think. Unfortunately, we haven't seen that many that you actually want to sacrifice that much, since the Afterlife cards were either the 1/2 Death Touch, which you'd rather trade with something usually, I think. Again, we're talking about limited here. This is not going to see any play in constructed. Or the 5 and 6 mana spells that, while they did have Afterlife too, like having that big body is usually going to be better than putting 2 counters on this thing, I think. Having said that, again, against enchantment-based removal, this has some play as well. A 4 mana 3/3 isn't the worst thing ever. Maybe you just have some token that you're going to sacrifice or something irrelevant that you can turn this into a larger creature for, so that's fine. Undercity's Embrace, it's an Edict. Edict's typically not great in limited. If you gain the 4 life on it, it's fine, but yeah, in limited, you usually want to bring them in certain matchups, but there's enough matchups where there's just too many small, irrelevant creatures littering the board that the Edict isn't that great. In constructed, yeah, maybe there's some enough matchups that this is good enough. On the other hand, there could easily be enough token decks that it's not. It is a way to get around hexproof from a card like Carnage Tyrant if you need to kill that. But I think in general, by that point in the game, there's usually better ways than standard. So don't expect to see a lot of play from this card. Vindictive Vampire is kind of like a Cutthroat, a Zulaport Cutthroat, but it costs 4 mana instead of 2, which is a big negative to it. Very plausible and limited, right? Again, this is damage instead of life loss. I'm not exactly sure why that is. They usually used to template this as life loss, but whatever. There's enough sacrifice stuff in black and limited, and just enough normal trades. This is probably okay, and it might see play if there's a sacrificey deck in standard as well. That's going to do it for black. The Han of Hightower, I guess, I'll talk about very quickly. It's a buy a box promo, so it's not going to be in the limited format, and I can't imagine that it's good enough in constructed. So that's all I have to say about it. So this has been black, and next up we'll have red.